So Karen Pelto, our NRD coordinator.
Oh, great. Sure. Yeah, while Paul's bringing up the slides, I just want to put in a plug. I'll be joined by Emily Sullivan of the town of Arlington this Saturday at the MACC conference, talking in part about this topic and also the project that the town of Arlington is implementing using NRD recovered funds from a spill in the upper Neponset. So I just wanted to mention that if you're going to be there, please stay for our workshop. So Liz asked me to give a brief update on where we are with the methods and regulatory development relative to the oil spills to surface waters and then the oil and hazardous materials releases to groundwater. And I should have said response to stakeholder comments. I realized on the train on the way in, but as you may recall, and for those who were not aware, last winter and spring we held stakeholder meetings, including some folks who are in this room today, to go over the methods that we had developed for determining natural resource damages for oil spills less than 10,000 gallons to surface water and also less than well, I'll get to that point in a minute, actually, as well as oil and hazardous materials releases to groundwater. And based on those conversations, as well as some written thoughts that we received following those stakeholder meetings, we did publish a response to the comments and questions that we got through that process, and those are posted on the NRD program website. We do have a page that's devoted to development of these standard methods as a way to give people an opportunity to learn about and track our progress. I do just want to highlight a couple of changes that resulted from that exchange with the stakeholders, which was very fruitful. One is a change to the oil spills to surface water, looking particularly at baseline. So when you are conducting a natural resource damages assessment, you're looking at sort of, but for the spill, what was the condition of the resource, in this case the surface water body or wetland, prior to the spill. So we need to find a way in a standard approach to determine baseline that does not require extensive site-specific data collection. And so based on stakeholder feedback, we changed our approach from something that did involve some site-specific observations toward more of a tabletop exercise based on the location of the spill and the context of that water body in its watershed, as well as the context of that water body in terms of its legacy, potential for legacy contaminants. So we will be looking at impervious cover and the 303D list so that the baseline value would be generated from that. The other change was that the original approach had kind of a multiplier if you were in what we call the special resource, such as, for example, an area of critical environmental concern. And the very thoughtful response back from the stakeholder group was, shouldn't that really factor into baseline? Because you might therefore be in a higher quality area, and that should be reflected in that topic. So we are working with Industrial Economics. They have been revising the model accordingly and actually are about to embark on another model test run with those changes. In terms of groundwater, the main change was more of a procedural one. It wasn't necessarily changes to the method itself, but realizing that because these sites are so diverse, we will just continue. We have been using this method, and we will continue to use it on a site-specific basis. The regulations will likely identify a series of factors that we would consider in determining whether or not to conduct an assessment. That's actually similar in terms of format to the federal process that we follow, where there is some pre-assessment work that goes before you decide actually to go forward with an NRD assessment and potential claim. So I just wanted to highlight those. You can see, as I said, the full list of questions that were raised and our responses to those on that web page. One of the other changes in response to the questions, because we got a lot of very detailed questions that related to this topic, we are actually working with a different set of staff at Industrial Economics to conduct and produce a report on a cost-benefit analysis, and then, of course, the required small business evaluation that's part of any regulatory process. And so as part of that, for the spills that we used to test the model, IEC's staff asked me to go through and identify, based on the potentially responsible party that was in our database, the North American Industry Classification System, or NAICS codes, because they needed that in order to determine who was considered a small business and conduct their analysis. One thing that we discovered that was really helpful to us was getting a better handle on the categories, broad categories of potentially responsible parties in that data set. Again, that was about 517 RTNs that we ended up using to test the model for oil spills between, I think it was 2007 and 2017. And what was really interesting is that the top two most frequent spillers in that data set were freight trucking companies and electric utilities, which was not necessarily what we expected. The next two you would expect, wholesale petroleum and non-petroleum entities. Then you've got marinas and small vessels. Those essentially are, privately owned boats, let's say, and fuel dealers. Then you've got construction and commercial and a little bit of residential. You've got heavy machinery working, and sometimes things happen. Then manufacturing and convenience and other stores being like hardware stores and supermarkets. Then you've got fishing vessels, and then lastly, gas stations. So in terms of spills to surface that make their way to surface waters, these are I would say, the major. Everything else is sort of less than 1%. There are other categories, but I just wanted to give you a flavor for what to expect to see in this cost-benefit and small business evaluation, and just give you a sense of what we've been learning about this potential universe. Our next steps is to complete that analysis with Industrial Economics. We'll be reviewing a draft from them at the end of next week, and then moving on to a public hearing draft, and which will include, as supporting materials, the report by Industrial Economics on the method and the model runs, as well as this cost-benefit analysis. And this will be released following the MCP revisions, which is a great segue to Liz, but I'm first going to stop and take questions, if you have any.
Well, I'm just going to say, Larry was whispering in my ear and said, well, that only adds up to 56%, so 57.
57. No, I said 50.
Oh, 57, sorry. I can't add in my head. I have to use a calculator. So all the other ones were others, or were those only the small businesses? I guess I was confused.
Oh, sure. So these aren't restricted to just small businesses. Okay. These are the ones that I thought you would be most interested in seeing. There are, for example, a number of municipal releases. That's probably about 8-9% as well. The other one that's probably 8-9% is actually residential, but those are ones that we would want to look more closely at, because that's how it's recorded in the database, but I don't know if we looked more closely, it might be that someone else cleaned it up, but it just was entered as residents. One of the things we've been learning is that with some of these, you need to look at the reports, because I guess I'll make a plug. I guess maybe if Brian wants to correct me, but I'll make a plug for being consistent in entering the data in these forms, because we get things spelled all different ways. We get things entered in really strange, strange ways. We had to really work with this data set to get it to the point where we could have a level of analysis. But that's one where I think we might need to sort of lift up and look a little more closely. There are some, but less so, state releases, and the rest are just things like real estate trusts. So it might be at a big apartment building or a condo association. That's probably 8 or 9%.
So why didn't you represent those? Those seem significant.
Because
to be
I
honest.
ran out of time.
Oh, okay.
So I wanted to give you a flavor
Gotcha.
for what I
That's
thought were the
fine.
most interesting things I've learned
Oh,
in starting this
that's fine.
effort.
Yeah,
But
sure.
perhaps when we put the slides up, I can finish that. It was my goal to have them all on the slide.
Yeah, that's fine.
Well, we can do that in the final slides that we post. We'll
Exactly.
fill
That would be
out.
good for us data heads that add things up and like them to.
Exactly. No, I knew that this.
Shame on you for adding.
No, and I knew this would happen because originally I tried to make a pie chart, and then I was like, no, that's misleading because there's pieces of that pie that I haven't counted up yet. And
Yeah.
so I just wanted to give you
A flavor.
a flavor, and it certainly sparked interest. So that's excellent.
Ultimately, Karen, all of that information will be in the report.
Oh yeah, IEC has they have all this information and all the codes, and they've been using that for their analysis. I just wanted to try to pull things out in terms of the types of industries that were represented by those codes, because I thought it would be of interest to you. And so,
Thank you.
and it is excellent.
Are eligible persons that acquire a contaminated site that contains contaminated wetlands subject to natural resource damages, or is it the original entity that caused the problem?
We get this question every
Could you repeat the question?
So the question, to repeat it and make sure I get it correctly, is an eligible person who acquires a property with contaminants, in this case in wetlands, responsible for natural resource damages, or is it the original party? I mean, I guess separate from this discussion, first, it's both, really. But I'm going to let, the answer is always let our attorneys answer the questions. Since our attorney's raising his hand,
So that's
he can describe it appropriately.
So that's a legal question. if you're an eligible person, you should hire an attorney and ask him or her whether you're liable or not. But what I can say is that I've certainly heard arguments made that eligible persons could be liable for NRD damages. I've never seen the Commonwealth collect NRD damages from eligible persons. And I also have seen brownfields covenants in which eligible persons have sought protection from NRD claims from the natural resource trustee. Those protections are generally granted routinely.
Thank you, because I appreciate that, because I think I was thinking in the context of some of the cases we've settled at Superfund sites where there are successors in interest, which is a very different thing. So thank you so much, Lee.
Also, I believe that was one of the questions that is in the response to comments. And I think, and I hope, we said something similar to what Luke just said.
Should we point out that Chris Ayers retired?
She did?
Oh,
Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
please.
Luke Rogers, ladies and gentlemen. Luke is the new wayside cleanup program attorney, stepping in after Chris Ayers retired at the end of December. So we're very, very happy. Luke has been working with the program for years, and we are delighted to have him now as the program attorney. And clearly, we are following the advice that when somebody asks about liability, we defer to the attorneys. He's taught us well.
Karen, what's your timeline on the next steps and then getting this?
Well, I think I'm actually going to turn that question over to Liz. The question is, what's the timeline? Because it relates a lot to the topic she's addressing, because we don't want to get ahead of the MCP package.
Well, I think what we've talked about is not to have both sets of regs out at the same time. So next we're going to talk about the schedule for the MCP. I think we will let that process wrap up, or at least get to the point where we're reviewing comments and redrafting before we would have this out, so that you all aren't subject to having to review two sets of regs. You all set? Are you-
I think there was the last question.